The drop in the ocean. There is a line that has circulated on the internet, in greeting cards, in corporate meditation rooms, attributed to the 13th century Persian poet Rumi. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. It is one of the most quoted lines of mystical poetry in the English-speaking world. Tonight, that line is not from Rumi. It does not appear in any scholarly translation of his work. Not in Nicholson, who produced the standard English Mathnawi. Not in Arbery, who translated his ghazals. Not in Mojaddedi, the most recent philological work from Oxford. It cannot be traced to anything Rumi wrote. It is a circulating fabrication. You've probably seen the quotes. You've probably never read the whole poem. But here is the strange thing. The actual Rumi did write about a drop and an ocean. He wrote about it more than once. And what he was actually describing was far more specific, far more demanding, and far more interesting than the greeting cards suggest. He was describing what Sufis call fana, the death of the self in God. Across the same century, on the other side of Asia, in the text that the Buddhist tradition had been preserving for 1700 years by then, there were other accounts of what happens when the separate self dissolves. The Buddha had answered the same question. He had answered it differently. Tonight, what Rumi was actually describing, what the Buddha found in the same territory, and why their two answers, both honest, both rigorous, both produced by people who had spent their entire lives in this country, disagree about what remains when the self is gone. Two of the most profound answers in human history to the same question, both worth hearing, neither reducible to the other. Chapter 1. The Rumi you know and the Rumi who wrote. The cultural Rumi is, by some measures, the best-selling poet in the United States. Not for the past 5 years, not for the past 10, for the past 3 decades. His lines appear on coffee mugs and yoga studio walls. They are read at weddings. They are quoted in self-help books and meditation apps. They show up in the speeches of celebrities, the captions of Instagram posts, the wellness sections of bookstores. You have probably encountered them, perhaps without knowing whose work you were reading. They have been recited by pop musicians, printed on t-shirts, used in corporate retreats, and tattooed on the arms of an unknown number of Americans who could not, if asked, name the religion Rumi practiced, which is a striking fact. Because the religion Rumi practiced is the entire frame of his poetry. He was a Muslim. More specifically, he was a Persian language Sufi mystic, working within a 13th century Islamic theological tradition. He was a trained jurist who taught at a madrasa. He wrote in the vocabulary of the Quran and the Hadith. Every poem he wrote presupposes the Prophet, the Sharia, and the specific Sufi understanding of how the soul moves toward God. You would not know any of this from the Rumi most Americans encounter. The quote we began with, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop," is the most famous example of what has happened to him in English. It is everywhere. It is also a fabrication. Search for it in Nicholson's 6-volume Mathnawi, the standard English edition. Search for it in Arbery's Mystical Poems of Rumi. Search for it in Mojaddedi's Oxford translation, the most rigorous philological work available. You will not find it. You will not find it because it is not there. What is there, and we will come to it in Chapter 2, is something different in almost every respect. Rumi did write more than once about a drop and an ocean, but what he was describing was not the soul realizing it had always been the whole. It was the soul giving itself up to be received by something larger than it, not the drop discovering the ocean inside, the drop dissolving into the ocean outside. The grammar is different. The metaphysics is different. The teaching is different. To understand how the fabrication replaced the original and what got lost in the substitution, we have to talk about the man who, more than any other single person, shaped the Rumi that Americans now know. His name is Coleman Barks. Barks is an American poet from Tennessee. He is, in many ways, a serious artist, a former English professor at the University of Georgia, a published poet in his own right, a man who has devoted nearly 50 years to the work of bringing Rumi to American readers. He did not set out to mislead anyone, and his Rumi has, by any commercial measure, been a phenomenon. The Essential Rumi, which Barks published in 1995, has sold roughly 1 million copies. That number is unheard of in poetry. It is unheard of in translation. It is one of the most successful books of poetry published in English in living memory. There is, however, one thing about Coleman Barks that needs to be stated plainly, because everything else flows from it. He does not read Persian. He has said this himself on multiple occasions without embarrassment, because in his own framing, it is not a contradiction. I literally have nothing to be faithful to, he has said, except what the scholars give me. His method is to take existing scholarly translations, primarily those of Nicholson and Arbery, both of whom did read Persian, and re-voice them in contemporary American English free verse. He is not translating Rumi. He is, in his own phrase, rendering Rumi from the rendered. This would be a minor curiosity if the renderings were faithful in spirit. They are not. The pattern has been documented repeatedly by people who do read Persian. Franklin Lewis, whose 700-page study Rumi, Past and Present, East and West, is the standard scholarly work on the poet, has written that Barks systematically removes the Islamic theological vocabulary from Rumi's poems. Where Rumi writes Allah, Barks writes the Beloved. Where Rumi quotes the Quran, Barks paraphrases into something that could read as a generic mystical aphorism. Where Rumi names the Prophet Muhammad, Barks often does not. Omid Safi, a scholar of Islamic studies at Duke, has written about the same pattern, calling it a kind of spiritual colonization. Rozina Ali, writing in The New Yorker in 2017, traced one specific case in detail. The famous line, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I will meet you there." It is, by some accounts, the most quoted Barks line in English. In Rumi's original, the words are not wrongdoing and right-doing. They are iman and kufr, faith and infidelity. The line is making a theological claim, in Islamic vocabulary, about the relationship between divine presence and the binary of belief. Barks's version removes the entire frame. What is left is something gentler, something more universal, something Rumi did not write. Lewis published his findings. Barks responded, in print, when asked about the critique. His reply, "I think Franklin needs to loosen up a little bit." That is the entire response. It does not engage the substance. It treats the question of philological accuracy as a kind of stiffness. There is a way to hear that response with sympathy. Barks did not invent this Rumi out of malice. He found, in the renderings he produced, something that spoke to a wide audience starving for a kind of warmth that mainstream American religion had stopped providing. That warmth is real. The audience is real. The hunger is real. But the Rumi who appears in those translations is, in important respects, not the Rumi who lived and wrote. It is important to be precise about what this is and what it is not. Sufism does not need rescuing by scholars. It is a 1400-year-old contemplative tradition with its own resources, its own teachers, its own readers in Persian and Arabic and Turkish and Urdu, none of whom were waiting for an American intervention. But the Rumi that most Americans know does need to be returned to its context. Not because the context is more important than the poetry, because without the context, the poetry is no longer what Rumi wrote. So who was he? This man whose work has been so thoroughly reshaped. He was born in 1207 in the town of Waksh, present-day Tajikistan, into a family of scholars and mystics. His father was a theologian, known as the Sultan al-Ulama, the Sultan of the Scholars. The great city of Balkh nearby gives Rumi his traditional epithet, Balkh, the one from Balkh. And this is how he was known to his contemporaries and how he is still often introduced in popular accounts. But the town where he actually came into the world was smaller, quieter, and it would be swept away by the Mongols within a generation. The Balkh tradition is partly hagiographical. Waksh is the better attested birthplace. The Mongol invasion forced the family west, across Persia and Anatolia, in a journey that lasted years. They settled, eventually, in the city of Konya, in what is now central Turkey. At that time, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, hence the name Ruma. The word does not name a place so much as a position. The Persian-speaking refugee who made his life among the Greek-speaking lands. He grew up to inherit his father's position. He was a respectable Muslim jurist with a teaching post, a wife, children, a reputation. He was nearing 40, and he was, by every account, a settled and successful man. Then, in 1244, a wandering dervish named Shams of Tabriz appeared in Konya. What happened between the two of them, no one has ever fully been able to describe. Rumi himself spent the rest of his life trying. The encounter changed him. It pulled him out of the respectable role he had occupied for decades. He neglected his students. He stopped lecturing. He spent days at a time in conversation with this stranger. This older man who spoke to him with a candor and a fierceness that no one in the academy had ever offered. Shams disappeared in 1248. The traditions say he was murdered, possibly by Rumi's own jealous students. The historical record is uncertain. What is certain is the grief. Out of that grief came the poetry. Tens of thousands of verses, dictated, sung, and whirled into existence over the next 25 years. All of it animated by the loss of one person who had cracked Rumi's life open. The opening of his great work, the Mathnawi, is a single image. A reed flute cut from the reed bed, crying about its separation from the place it came from. Ever since I was parted from the reed bed, my lament has caused man and woman to moan. This is the reed flute's complaint. It is also Rumi's. It is also, in the theology, the soul's. The separation that all the longing of the poems is about is, finally, the separation of the soul from God. This is the man whose work has been reshaped into greeting card wellness. He was not a teacher of generic spirituality. He was a Sufi mystic, working in a specific theological tradition, describing a specific path. That path has a name. It is called fana, and it means the annihilation of the self in God. To follow Rumi where he actually went, past the wellness quotes, into the substance of the poetry, we have to understand what fana is. We have to understand what it claims about the self that ordinary experience presents to us. We have to understand what the Sufi tradition says is on the other side. And we have to understand why this, for 13 centuries now, in the Islamic mystical tradition, has been treated not as a metaphor for personal growth, but as the literal terminus of the spiritual life. That is the territory we will enter next. It is also, as we will see, very close to the territory the Buddha was describing 12 centuries earlier, and on a different continent, when he spoke of the dissolution of the wrong view of self. The two traditions look, in their description of this dissolution, as though they are describing the same experience. They are not. They are describing the same disappearance. But what each tradition reports finding on the other side of that disappearance is different. We will get to the Buddha's answer in chapter 3. First, Rumi's. Chapter 2, Fana, the death of the self in God. To get inside the doctrine of fana, you have to start with a word that English does not have a clean equivalent for. The word is nafs. Nafs is, in the Sufi understanding, the ego self. It is the part of you that says I. It is the part of you that wants and refuses, that grasps and clings, that compares itself to others, that takes credit and assigns blame, that constructs an entire interior life around the question of its own continuation. It is also, in the Quranic vocabulary that Rumi inherited, the part of the soul that is restless, that commands evil, that has to be tamed and refined, and finally, in the mystical path, undone altogether. The undoing has a name. It is called fana. The literal meaning of the Arabic root is annihilation, passing away, perishing. In the Sufi technical sense, fana refers to the annihilation of the ego self in the presence of God. This is not metaphor. It is not symbolic of personal growth. It is not a poetic figure for feeling more connected. It is a specific experiential and metaphysical claim about what happens, what must happen, when the soul actually approaches the divine. The self, the nafs, ceases. What was experiencing itself as a separate I no longer does. The classical Sufi analyst described fana as having stages. The first stage is fana al-Hallaj, the annihilation of one's own agency. The seeker recognizes, no longer abstractly, but immediately, that what they had been calling my action was not, in the way they thought, theirs to author. The sense of being the one doing the doing falls away. The second stage is fana al-Sifat, the annihilation of attributes, the qualities the self had identified with, kind, learned, devout, ashamed, are recognized as not properties of an independent agent, but as the play of qualities in something that has no independent existence to underwrite them. The third stage is fana al-Dat, the annihilation of the very sense of selfhood. The I that has been the implicit subject of every experience is no longer experienced. This is the territory the wine of the Sufi poets is about. When Rumi writes about being drunk, and he writes about it constantly, he is not writing about alcohol. He cannot be. The Quran prohibits the physical drink. The wine in the poems is the dissolution of the self in divine presence. The cup is the heart that holds it. The beloved is the one who pours. The intoxication is the loss of the sober, calculating, separate ego in something larger. The Quranic grounding for all of this sits in a single famous verse. In Surat Ar-Rahman, the 55th chapter, Kullu man alayha fan, wa yabqa wajhu rabbika. All that is on earth will perish, but there will remain the face of your Lord, possessor of majesty and honor. The word fan, perishing, and the word yabqa, remaining, sit together in a single verse. Everything that has come into being passes away. What remains is the face of God. The Sufi doctrine of fana and baqa, annihilation and subsistence, reads itself directly out of this verse. The self perishes. What remains, remains in God. This raises an immediate question, and Sufi theologians have been answering it carefully for more than 1,000 years. If the self is annihilated in God, and what remains is God, what is the relationship between the two? Has the human become God? Has God descended into the human? The classical answer, given most precisely by the 9th century master Junaid of Baghdad, is no. Junaid is a foundational figure in Sufi theology, the teacher whose framework is taken as authoritative across most of the later tradition. He insisted on a distinction that Sufism, in its disciplined form, has held to ever since. Fana is not ittihad. Ittihad is a union of two essences into one, the merging of the human substance and the divine substance into a single thing. Junaid rejects this. Fana is also not hulul. Hulul is incarnation, the descent of God into a human vessel, the indwelling of the divine in a particular human being. Junaid rejects this too. What fana is, in Junaid's formulation, is the disappearance of the lower self into the will of God. The completion of fana is baqa, subsistence. The departure of the lower self, in his words, implies the appearance of the true self. Something remains, but what remains is not the nafs. The nafs is gone. What remains is the true self. And the true self, in this theology, is constituted by its relationship to God, not by its substance. This precision matters. Without it, the doctrine collapses into one of the two heresies Islamic theology has guarded against most strenuously, either a pantheism in which God and creation are not really distinct, or a personal divinity in which a particular human being is taken to be God. Sufism is neither. It claims something subtler. The drop dissolves in the ocean. But the ocean is not the drop, and the drop is not the ocean. The drop's true identity is realized only when it ceases to insist on its dropness, which brings us, at last, to what Rumi actually wrote about the drop and the ocean. The passage is in the 4th book of the Mathnawi, around verses 2600. Here is Nicholson's translation, the standard scholarly English version, of the heart of it. Hark, O drop, give thyself up without repenting, that in recompense for the drop thou mayst gain the ocean. Hark, O drop, bestow on thyself this honour, and in the hand of the sea become safe from destruction. Whom indeed should fortune like this befall? A sea has become the suitor for a drop. That is what Rumi wrote about the drop and the ocean. Listen to what it actually says. The drop is being addressed directly in the second person. It is being told to give itself up, without repenting, without holding back, without looking for a way to preserve itself. What it will gain in exchange for the surrender is the ocean. Not the discovery that it was always the ocean, not the realization that the ocean is inside it. The ocean is something other than the drop, and the drop is being invited to disappear into it, and then comes the strange and beautiful turn. A sea has become the suitor for a drop. The ocean is described as having courted the drop. The asymmetry of size is total, and the asymmetry of desire is reversed. The vast is reaching for the small. The drop is not seeking the ocean. The ocean is seeking the drop. The drop's task is to consent. Nicholson, in his note on the passage, glosses it this way. The drop's outward form has disappeared into the sea, but its essence is inviolate and permanent. That is the theology. Fana is followed by baqa. The form is gone. The essence subsists in the sea. Rumi returns to this image in a different key, in one of his ghazals, in Arbery's English. Did I not say to you, I am the sea and you are a single fish. Go not to dry land, for I am your crystal sea. Here the divine voice is the speaker. The fish is the soul. The sea is the medium without which the fish cannot live. To leave the sea, to insist on a separate selfhood on dry land, is to die. To stay in the sea is to live. These are beautiful passages. They are also, taken seriously, claims with consequences. If the drop's task is to disappear into the ocean, what happens to a mystic who actually arrives there? What happens when someone, in the actual experience, no longer experiences themselves as a separate entity, but only as the divine reality acting through what was once their self. The classical Islamic answer to that question is the story of al-Hallaj. His full name was Abu al-Mughith al-Husayn ibn Mansur al-Hallaj. He was a Persian Sufi mystic, born around the year 858 in what is now southwestern Iran. He was a wandering preacher, an ecstatic, a man who in his later years made public statements about his union with God that no Islamic jurist could allow to pass without response. The most famous of those statements consists of 3 words. Al-Haqq. The phrase is usually translated, I am the truth, but that translation undersells it. Al-Haqq, the truth, the real, is one of the 99 names of God in the Islamic tradition. To say Al-Haqq is to say not, I have grasped truth, or I speak truthfully, but, in effect, I am God. It is the kind of statement that can only be made from inside the experience of fana, and the kind of statement that, said out loud, brings the entire weight of the legal tradition down on the speaker. That weight came. Al-Hallaj was imprisoned for years. He was tried. The formal charge that finally allowed his execution, as Louis Massignon documented in the great 20th century study of his case, was not al-Haqq itself. It was a separate charge, that he had taught that the obligation of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, could be fulfilled by ritual acts performed at home. Tampering with the legal structure of Islamic practice was a charge the political authorities could prosecute. He was beheaded in Baghdad on the 26th of March in the year 922. The political context, a weak caliph, shifting viziers, a Sufi movement that some in power found threatening, was decisive. What happened next is in some ways more interesting than the execution. Al-Hallaj did not disappear from Islamic thought. He became one of its most contested figures, and the contest has been going on for 1100 years. Mainstream Sunni orthodoxy, the schools of law and theology that emerged in the centuries after his death, generally condemned him. To say, I am God, is shirk, the cardinal sin of associating something with God. From this angle, al-Haqq is the limit case of shirk. It does not merely associate something with God, it declares that the speaker himself is God. The execution was, in this reading, just. Much of the Sufi tradition, however, has venerated al-Hallaj as a martyr. From this angle, al-Haqq is what fana sounds like from the inside. It is not the speaker claiming divinity. It is the divine speaking through a vessel in which the speaker, as a separate entity, no longer exists. Rumi himself defended al-Hallaj in this spirit. In the Mathnawi, addressing the case directly, Rumi argues that when the I has been negated from existence, when the ego has truly passed away, then what is left to speak? Only the real. The statement in this reading is the most rigorous declaration of Tawhid, the unity of God that a human voice can make. There is a traditional account, drawn from the hagiographical work of the 12th century poet Attar, that al-Hallaj's own teacher Junaid signed the warrant for his execution, distinguishing the doctrine of fana, properly held in inner experience and silence, from its public proclamation. That account is part of the tradition. It is not established as a historical fact. It is passed on as the tradition has it. This is the territory where a Buddhist account, set side by side with the Sufi account, has something specific to offer, not as a judgment, as a contrast, from a Buddhist angle, and we will come to the full Buddhist treatment in Chapter 3. The statement al-Haqq would read as a particularly exalted form of Sakayaditi, the view of self-identity. From this angle, the very sentence, I am, even the sentence I am God, keeps a subject in place. There is a sentence, and the sentence has a subject. The Buddhist analysis says that as long as there is a subject, the work is not yet finished. That is a reading. It is one lens. It is not a verdict. Islam itself has been debating this question with extraordinary seriousness for 1100 years. The Sufi tradition that produced al-Haqq did not produce it in ignorance of the danger. It produced it with full knowledge of the danger, and many of its most rigorous practitioners, Junaid among them, held that the statement was not the goal of the path, but a sign of its incompletion. The Sufi tradition is internally complex on this. It does not need an outside reading to settle the question. What the Buddhist account offers, set next to the Sufi one, is a comparative datum. The same dissolution that the Sufi describes does not, in Buddhist practice, generate a statement like al-Haqq. It generates a different statement, one we will hear in chapter 3. One more correction, and then we can name what the Sufi answer actually is. The whirling ceremony, the slow turning dance, white robes flaring, that is now the most photographed expression of Sufi practice in the world, is associated with Rumi's name. Tour buses in Konya carry visitors to watch it. It appears on the covers of Sufi books in English language bookstores. It is often described as something Rumi founded. He did not. What Rumi did was whirl spontaneously in moments of grief and ecstasy. The tradition records him turning around a pillar in the marketplace after Shams disappeared, his head tilted, his arms out, his composition pouring out of him in dictated verse. Those moments were not choreographed. They were not done in robes. They were not part of a ritual, the formal ceremony, the sama, the structured turning practice with its prescribed positions and its codified symbolism, was developed by the order of dervishes that grew from Rumi's followers over the 2 centuries after his death. It was formalized in something close to its current shape by Pir Adil Chelebi, who died in 1460. The symbolic vocabulary that often accompanies it in modern Sufi explanation. The right hand raised to receive grace from heaven, the left hand lowered to pour it onto earth. The tall hat representing the ego's tombstone, the white robe its shroud, belongs to that later tradition. It is beautiful, it is meaningful, it is not Rumi, which finally allows us to name, plainly, what the Sufi answer is. The drop dissolves into the ocean. The divine ground remains. The ocean was always there. The drop's truth is that it belonged to the ocean all along. The annihilation of the nafs is not an end in itself. It is the necessary clearing for what is on the other side. And on the other side, the answer is unambiguous. God remains. The real subsists. The face of the Lord, in the Quranic vocabulary, abides when everything else perishes. This is a positive theology. Sufism, like the larger Islamic tradition it belongs to, is willing to say what is there at the end of the path. There is God. There is the beloved. There is the one who has, in Rumi's image, become the suitor for the drop. The drop's job is to consent to be received. For 13 centuries, this has been the answer that the Islamic mystical tradition has given to the question we began with. What happens when the separate self dissolves? It dissolves into something. That something has a name. That name is God. Now we turn to the other side of the question. In the same centuries, in another tradition, in another language, on another continent, the Buddha had been describing a dissolution that, in its phenomenology, looks startlingly like the one the Sufis describe. The wrong view of self falls away. The constructed sense of being a separate, continuous experiencer is recognized as a construction. The grasping that maintained that sense ceases, and then the Buddhist tradition does something the Sufi tradition does not do. It declines to fill in what remains. Chapter 3. What the Buddha Found. The Buddhist tradition begins, in this territory, with a precise piece of vocabulary. The technical term is Sakkaya Ditthi. It is usually translated as self-identity view, or, more bluntly, the view of self. Sakkaya Ditthi is not the self. It is the view that there is a self. The implicit assumption that runs through ordinary experience that there is a continuous, bounded, separate entity that wakes up each morning and goes to bed each night, and to whom everything happening in the meantime is happening. The Buddhist analysis is that this view is a construction, and that the construction can be examined, and that when it is examined carefully, it does not hold up. This is a different starting point from the Sufi one. The Sufi describes a nafs that is real and must be undone. The drop exists. It must dissolve. The Buddhist describes a view that is a construction. The drop, in this analysis, was never quite as solid as it took itself to be. The work is not to make the drop dissolve. The work is to see what the drop actually is. And the seeing, fully accomplished, releases the grip. In the earliest stage of awakening that the Buddhist tradition recognizes, what the tradition calls stream entry, Sakkaya Ditthi is the first thing to fall away. Not the self, the view of the self. The implicit assumption gets seen through. The grasping at it relaxes. What is left, the tradition says, is not a different self. It is a clearer relationship to the same experience, now no longer organized around the assumption of a separate someone to whom the experience is happening. That is the entry. The territory it opens onto, in the Buddhist analysis, is something else entirely. And here is where the contrast with the Sufi account becomes most precise. The Buddha did, in fact, speak about what lies on the other side of the constructed self. He did so in some of the most carefully chosen language preserved in the Pali Canon. The passage is brief. It appears in the Udana, an early collection of inspired utterances. It is numbered 8.3, and the numbering matters because a very similar passage appears at 8.1, and these are often confused. Here is what UD 8.3 says. In Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation, there is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case that escape from the born, become, made, fabricated, would be discerned. Listen to what this passage does, and what it does not do. It affirms that something is there. There is an unborn. There is an unbecome. There is an unmade, an unfabricated. Without that, the Buddha says, there would be no possibility of escape from the conditioned. The point of the practice would not have a destination. So the passage refuses the reading that Buddhism is simply nihilism, that on the other side of awakening there is nothing. But it also refuses with equal care the reading that the something on the other side is God. There is no name given. There is no beloved. There is no face of the Lord. There is no ocean that has become the suitor for the drop. The only characterization is negative. Unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. The four words are apophatic. They tell you what the unconditioned is not. They refuse to say what it is. This is not an accident of translation. It is not a gap in the early tradition that later teachers filled in. It is, in the Buddhist analysis, the most honest thing that can be said. To name the unconditioned as God, or as ocean, or as anything else, is already to import categories belonging to the conditioned world, and the unconditioned, by definition, cannot be captured by such categories. To say less is to say more. This same refusal sits at the center of one of the most extraordinary passages in the early Buddhist texts. A dialogue preserved in the Majjhima Nikaya, the 72nd discourse between the Buddha and a wandering philosopher named Vacchagotta. Vacchagotta wants to know what happens to a fully awakened person after death. Does he reappear? Does he not reappear? Does he both reappear and not reappear? Does he neither reappear nor not reappear? Vacchagotta presses each of the four options. To each one, the Buddha says, it does not apply. Then the Buddha offers a simile. A fire has gone out, extinguished. Someone asks, in which direction did the fire go? North, south, east, west? The question does not apply, the Buddha says. The fire was burning because of conditions, fuel, oxygen, heat. When the conditions ceased, the fire ceased. There is no direction in which the fire is now traveling. There is no place where the fire now resides. And then, in this same discourse, MN 72, comes one of the most striking images in the canon. In Thanisaro's translation, freed from the classification of consciousness, Vaccha, the Tathagata, is deep, boundless, hard to fathom, like the sea. Reappears doesn't apply. Does not reappear doesn't apply. Notice what is happening with the sea image. Rumi's ocean is a destination. The drop dissolves into it. The sea has become the suitor for the drop, and what remains in Baka remains in the sea. The image is positive. The ocean is a real thing that contains a real essence after the drop's form has gone. The Buddha's sea is something else. It is not a destination. It is not the divine ground that the drop reaches. It is an image of unfathomability. A way of saying that the categories that would let us describe what has happened do not apply, that the description has reached the limit of what conditioned language can do. Reappears does not apply. Does not reappear does not apply. The image is used to refuse description, not to provide one. The same dissolution. Two different uses of the same image. Two different things being said. The most extreme form of this refusal sits in another conversation with the same Vacchagotta, preserved in the 44th chapter of the Samyutta Nikaya, in the 10th discourse. Vacchagotta asks the Buddha directly, does the self exist? The Buddha is silent. Vacchagotta asks, does the self not exist? The Buddha is silent again. Vacchagotta leaves. Later, when the Buddha's attendant Ananda asks why the Buddha did not answer, the Buddha gives his reason. If he had answered the self exists, that would have aligned him with the eternalists, the people who hold that there is a permanent, abiding self that survives. If he had answered the self does not exist, that would have aligned him with the annihilationists, the people who hold that there is a self now which will be destroyed at death, and that nothing remains. Both answers, the Buddha says in SN 44.10, would have misled the questioner. So he was silent. This silence is the precise opposite of the Sufi al-Haqq. It is also the precise opposite of pure negation. It is a refusal to take either of the two positions that would falsely characterize the unconditioned, either by adding too much to it or by subtracting too much. What it leaves is what the early Buddhist tradition seems to have most wanted to leave: a practice, a path, a direction, and, at the end of the path, a release from conditions whose nature the tradition declines to specify in positive terms. The drop, in the Buddhist analysis, looks for what remains when it dissolves, and finds that the question was already shaped by an assumption that no longer fits. There was no separate drop that was about to merge into something else. There was only the play of conditions giving rise to the appearance of a separate drop. When the appearance is seen through, what is left is not a drop dissolving into an ocean. What is left is the cessation of the conditions that maintain the appearance. The drop did not drown. There was no drowner. There is only the unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, which the Buddha will not call an ocean. That is the Buddhist answer. Close. 2 maps, 1 territory. Before we set the 2 answers side by side, there is a temptation that needs to be named and refused. The temptation is to say, in the end, they are both describing the same thing. The Sufi and the Buddhist have both arrived at the same reality, and the only difference is the cultural clothing they put on what they found. The Sufi calls it God because that was the language available to a 13th century Persian Muslim. The Buddhist refuses to name it because that was the discipline of the early Pali tradition. Underneath the names, the experience is identical. This view has a name. It is called perennialism, the position that all the great mystical traditions are pointing in their own vocabularies to one universal underlying reality. It has its defenders. Aldous Huxley made the case for it most famously in the middle of the 20th century. It still circulates in popular books on comparative spirituality. It is, on the face of it, generous. It honors all traditions by saying none of them is wrong. It also, on closer inspection, honors none of them. The most rigorous critique of the perennialist position was made by the philosopher Stephen Katz in an essay published in 1978, a piece that has shaped the academic study of mysticism ever since. Katz's argument is simple, and it is hard to argue with. There are, he wrote, no pure unmediated experiences. Experience does not arrive in the mind already labeled. It is shaped at every level by the categories the mind brings to it. The language, the concepts, the prior training, the framing assumptions, the entire interpretive apparatus that the person has spent a lifetime constructing. This is not a claim about ordinary experience only. It is a claim about mystical experience as well. The Sufi mystic enters the experience of fana with a lifetime of Quranic study, a vocabulary of nafs and baqa and al-Haqq, an embodied tradition of practice, an expectation about what is on the other side. The Buddhist practitioner enters the dissolution of Sakkayaditthi with a lifetime of training in the Four Noble Truths, the analysis of conditioned arising, the apophatic vocabulary of the early canon, a different expectation about what is on the other side. These are not neutral instruments approaching one undifferentiated reality. They are differently shaped instruments shaping differently shaped experiences. There is a counter view worth naming. Robert Foreman, in the late 20th century, argued for the possibility of pure consciousness events, states in which all conceptual content drops out, and in which the perennialist claim might still be defensible. The debate is live. It is not over, but what Katz's argument forecloses, with considerable force, is the lazy version of the perennialist move, the version that flattens differences in service of a comforting universalism, the version that says it does not finally matter what tradition you come from, because all paths lead to the same summit. Even if Foreman is right about something, the Katzian point holds against the easy reading. A Sufi fana for Allah and a Buddhist anatta cannot simply be two reports of one identical underlying experience. The reports differ, the traditions differ, the expectations differ. And in mystical experience, expectation is not noise, it is structure, which means that when we set the two answers side by side, we are not setting up a comparison to find out which one got the truth and which one got the cultural overlay. We are doing something more interesting than that. We are putting two genuinely different answers next to each other, each produced by a serious tradition working at the highest level it could, each describing something that the tradition stands behind as honestly as it knows how, and we are letting them speak in their own voices. Here is what they say. Rumi's poet says, "I drowned, and what remained was the ocean." The Buddha's practitioner says, "I looked for what drowned, and found there was no drowner." These are not the same answer. They are two of the most profound answers in human history to the same question. And the question is one that anyone who has lived long enough to have wondered seriously about what they are has eventually had to face. What is the self I have been carrying around all these years? What is it made of? What is it for? And what happens when the assumption that it is the central fact of my experience starts to loosen? The Sufi answers, the self was real. It must be relinquished, and what receives it has a name. The drop dissolves into the ocean. The ocean was always there. The Buddhist answers, the self was a construction. It must be seen through, and what is on the other side is not named, because to name it is already to misdescribe it. The drop was never what it took itself to be. There was no ocean waiting. There was only the cessation of the conditions that made it appear there was a drop in the first place. These two answers do not reduce to each other. The Sufi cannot be paraphrased as the Buddhist with a different vocabulary. The Buddhist cannot be paraphrased as the Sufi with the divinity edited out. They are, in their actual claims about what is there at the end of the path, different. And both are honored when we say this, not when we collapse them. This was not a comparison to find the winner. It was a meeting of two traditions that have both spent centuries in the territory where the self dissolves and came back with different maps. The territory is real. The dissolution is real. The two maps are both made by people who actually went there. And the maps disagree. That disagreement is the substance of what we have been listening to tonight. Two of the most profound answers in human history, both worth reading, neither reducible to the other. The honoring of both without collapsing the difference is the payoff.